I stepped up the old wooden steps of the porch to what would be our new home. It was nice enough. It had a big backyard fenced with barbed wire, with a massive tree and a sturdy-looking tire swing. Most importantly, the neighboring houses were probably about a mile away each. This was country land, and you definitely smelled it. Occasionally, the wind would carry over the smell of manure, and all you had to do is open up a window, and bam, cow crap. I wasn't like most other 16-year-old girls, though. I didn't throw a hormonal fit for my parents over moving to a less than perfect new home. Regardless, these things didn't bother me too much anyways. I guess I've always just been pretty laid back about stuff. Life, really. I was mostly an introvert, so I never really had any friends, other than long-distance ones I had met and known over the years through online multiplayer games. I was definitely a gamer, but I didn't let that get in the way of my health. I didn't feel right if I didn't go jogging at least every 3 days. I loved to run, and occasionally I would pick up yoga to keep things interesting. Staying physically active helped my mood. Enough about me. The interior of the house even looked nicer than the exterior did. I got a big bedroom upstairs with a window that looked out the backyard. I was pretty happy with the place, except for one thing that really turned me off. A serial killer used to live in this house. Yes, a serial killer. That's why the price had dropped so low. He was apparently a doctor too. Stanley Hutler was his name, and he had worked at the hospital up in town not too far away, and would do the sickest things to his victims. He would get them inside his house, this one, and keep them down in the basement. He would torture and sexually assault them, but not before removing their vocal cords first. He would sew their eyes shut and keep them tied up for the rest of their lives. Their limbs would eventually get stuck in positions they were bound in and could hardly be moved at all on their own. He would feed them, though, through feeding tubes. And that was their life from that point forward, until they eventually died of infection, malnutrition, or bleeding injuries. After he was caught, he was sentenced to life without parole, but he escaped. Nobody knew where he was now, but the police suspected that he still visited the house because 2 entire families went missing a few months after moving in. After that, a high-tech security system was installed in around the house, but nobody ever moved in after that, until we came along. Now, if it weren't for all this, I would have really liked the place, but thanks to its history, I was always on edge. The first night there, I decided to bring my yoga mat down into the furnished basement. None of us had gone down there yet because that's where he used to keep his victims. It was the beginning of spring, so it was still pretty chilly outside and in the basement. But that wasn't the only problem with the basement. It reeked. It smelled like something rotten, and it was coming from everywhere down there. Once I was down there, I decided to work on the temperature first. I immediately began searching for the thermostat because each level of the house had its own. I found it and turned it up a bit. That feeling whenever it's freezing and you're waiting for the heaters to kick in and make a difference, only I never really felt that much heat coming in from the vents. The airflow was weak, very weak. There was something else about the basement that struck me as odd. There was holes in the walls of the thin wooden walls, about the size of golf balls. Then I realized something. Were there dead rodents in the walls? Was there stench coming in through the holes everywhere? About the holes everywhere, there were at least 3 in every wall at different heights, and nearly all of them had stains underneath, like something at one point had been leaking or rotting out of them. When I got close to one of them, soft puffs of warm air ventilated out into my face. Oh, that smell! Were the heating pipes in the walls busted, broken, chewed through somehow? The heat was coming only a few of the holes, and it carried the stench of decay with it. Instead of being transferred into the vents in the basement, the heat was leaking out inside the walls. I told my dad, who came downstairs to investigate. Except for me, none of my family had been down there. I've always been more of the confrontal, do what I want type of person, so the house history, although it deeply disturbed me, wasn't going to bring me down to what I needed to do. For my own health and self-esteem, despite my strong-willed behavior for things I wanted to do to be happy, I was bullied a lot in school and had always self-esteem issues. My dad agreed with me about the stench and said it would talk to the landlord about it tomorrow. As now, it was nearing 7 o'clock. After riding for so long, all of us were pretty tired, and we all ended up passing out on our beds earlier than we normally go to sleep. The next day went pretty smoothly. The movers came in with the rest of our things. The first night we could only bring what would fit on the trailer, and after a long, laborious day of unpacking and setting up my things, we finally settled into our new house. My dad had indeed contacted the landlord about the problem in the basement, but he wouldn't be able to come by until tomorrow. Go figure. This frustrated my dad as well as me, but nothing could be done about it. We simply had to wait. That night, I decided to actually do some yoga, which I was still fairly new to, in the basement, and just though out of the smell, it was quiet down there that night, quiet and cold. I rolled out my yoga mat in the middle of the biggest part of the basement, got positioned on top of it, and started doing my stretches. It was cold down there, but I was having a hard time focusing because I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched. The thought popped into my head at once, is that sick freak living in the walls watching me through these holes? The thought made me feel even colder, but I pushed it out of my mind. That was ridiculous. That kind of stuff only happens in movies and scary stories. I turned the thermostat up higher like before. Only a few of the holes were ventilating heat and the actual vents were doing a sorry job. I made my way back to the yoga mat. Then I saw part of the wall on the other side of the basement start to wiggle, and to my horror, it slowly hinged open, creaking softly. It was a hidden door, and into the basement, out the walls, stepped a tall man in bloody scrubs, looking at me, smiling with big, crazed eyes. He was holding a scalpel. I screamed, backing up against the wall behind me, feeling the warm, stinky heat venting out of against the back of my neck. The man rushed over and grabbed me, throwing me to the floor and getting on top of me. He pressed his hand down over my mouth and held the scalpel to my throat, lowering his weight down on top of me. "Be a good girl," he whispered. Without warning, my dad flung open the door to the basement, running down the stairs. "Morgan!" he shouted. "Dad, help me!" I screamed, muffled under the man's hand, but as loudly as I possibly could. The man whom I knew beyond of a shadow with a doubt at this point was Stanley Hutler, jumped off me and lunged at my dad with the scalpel. My dad managed to dodge it, making a graze with his forearm, instead of sticking it into his chest, and the next thing I know, the two of them are scuffling on the floor. I did the one thing I could. When I saw my chance, I ran up to him and kicked Stanley in the side of the head with my toes upward as hard as I could, knocking him to the floor next to my dad. The scalpel fell from his hand, and at that point I couldn't stop myself. I ran over and grabbed it, held it over my head with the sharp end down, and stabbed it deep in Stanley's throat. "Die, you bastard!" I heard myself scream. The police got there surprisingly quickly, but of course Stanley was dead. I never got in any kind of trouble for killing him. After all, he was a wanted serial killer and had attacked my dad and me. He would no doubt would have tried to go after the rest of my family too. That was the end of Stanley Hutler. However, his secret residence wasn't the only chilling revelation. When the police entered the area Stanley had emerged from, they found themselves venturing through spaces that had been regularly used for travel inside the walls and eventually came across a dead body. But that wasn't all. A team came in and started tearing down all the thin wooden hole-ridden boards that made up the walls, and what I saw inside was burned into my mind forever. Bodies. They had all been tightly bounded to the wooden post with their eyelids sewn shut and their vocal cords removed. Every single one of those holes was lined up with a mouth of an imitated person with brown decaying teeth. The pipes were indeed cut in certain places to make the room for some of the victims. The walls were pressed tightly up against the bodies, so when they tore them down, most of the skin on their open lids was ripped off, as it had attached itself to the interior surface of the walls after being pressed against them for so long. Those holes were breathing and feeding holes. That's how Stanley fed them, through their tubes. Being a doctor, he had operated on each one, extending their uterus and rectums with rubber tubes that merged into the house main sewage line. Many of them had died from infections in those areas. The bodies blocked most out of the heat from getting to the actual vents, not to mention the scudding of the pipes, but none of the heat should have been leaking out through the holes, because there simply wasn't enough room in front of the victim's mouth. A total of 12 imitated bodies with reeking rotten teeth and limbs were found inside those walls. 4 of them were still alive and breathing.